Chickens take the blunt of a lot of the cold, and that's a lot of cold stress and a lot of winter stress on the birds. So the way we feed them is going to have to help deal with that. It's also going to have to give them a little bit more energy, and it's going to have to help with the molting that they often do in the wintertime. Good morning, folks. It's a little cold today out in my shed here. So what better time for talking about winter animal feed? Let's talk about feeding chickens in the winter. I live up in Michigan, and we have about 5 months of winter weather up here. There's 5 months that we're going to have snow on the ground in the year. And that's basically from somewhere in November to around somewhere in March. So we get a lot of cold. Not as bad as it could be, but it's cold, good and cold. And chickens are one of the animals that don't generally get brought into a barn or anything like that in the winter. They get their little coop, but it's not usually quite as sheltered and warm as you get in some of the barn animals. Of course, I don't have a barn anyways, but chickens take the blunt of a lot of the cold, and that's a lot of cold stress and a lot of winter stress on the birds. So the way we feed them is going to have to help deal with that. It's also going to have to give them a little bit more energy, and it's going to have to help with the molting that they often do in the wintertime. So here's 5 ingredients for winter chicken feed. The first one is fermented grain. I like my chalkboard. Fermented grain, any type of a whole grain. I'm talking whole corn, cracked corn, scratch grain, anything like that. A bag of oats, that's fine. We're going to ferment it. We're going to take that grain and put it in something like a 5-gallon bucket, or even if you want to do small scale, you can do it in a couple mason jars. I'm going to fill the container about 2/3 with grain, and I'm going to top it off with water so that it's a very it's float so that the grain is floating like a bowl of breakfast cereal. And then I'm going to keep it between 70 and 75 degrees for about 2 days. If it's within that range, then it takes about 2 days to get a good fermentation. If it's a little bit below 70, it's probably going to take a 3rd day. At about 69 degrees, at 68 degrees, it tends to take a 3rd day to ferment. And what I'm doing is just letting that liquid ferment until I get a pH of approximately 4.3. I want it to be below a 4.5 pH. 4.3 is good, and that's the level of carbonic acid and lactic acid being built up within the solution, that it breaks down the undigestible fibers and the undigestible proteins and the hull of those grains so that the birds get more out of it. But the bigger action is in the microbial benefits and the gut benefits. Golly, it's cold out here. That we get out of it. So it's a very potent, very powerful probiotic to chickens, even if you're just giving them a little bit every day as a snack. We actually feed that as our primary energy source throughout the winter. So we feed quite heavy on that stuff, mostly a fermented corn and oats. But it helps their gut to become more proficient and more efficient at breaking down and absorbing nutrients. Their nutrition uptake is going to be increased, and their overall metabolic rate is going to be able to increase on the same amount of feed. So giving your chickens just a little bit of a fermented grain in the winter, it's a great thing. I will say, maybe especially if it's on a cold winter day, warm it up a little bit first, because it ain't no fun if they gotta go and eat frozen fermented grain, and that's just hard on them. And during the real hard days of winter, as much as you can, try to warm up some of their wet feed or some of their water you've given to them. I like to go and set their feed buckets next to the wood stove to warm up before I bring out our fermented feed. The next thing is sunflower seed. Sunflower seed, I love it because it's actually got about 20 to 30% more energy in it than your standard yellow corn that's in chicken feed. So by adding sunflower seed, we are adding energy to the to the chicken feed. It's actually warming up in here just a little bit. So sunflower seed has about 30% more digestible energy, 30% more calories per pound than corn. And it's actually very high in fat. If you didn't know that, sunflower seed is approximately 40-ish percent sunflower oil. And it's that high oil content that give it so much extra energy. And the oils in sunflower seed are a good oil. It's a beneficial oil that actually helps to regulate the hormonal responses in chickens, that helps to control their body temperatures a little bit better. So sunflower seed helps. Another one that I like is bean, and I'm talking common bean. So things like kidney beans, pinto beans, and black beans. Common bean. Beans have a pretty good amount of protein, usually between about 24 and 28% protein in a bean. So considering that your standard chicken feed is 16 or 18%, by adding beans, we are upping the protein. And that's unlike with the fermented grains and the sunflower seed. We can actually be watering down the protein because that grain has less protein than the feed. And sunflower seed only has about a max of around 16% protein. So that would actually water down the protein content of the feed if you're doing a higher protein feed. Whereas common bean, 24 to 28% protein, it's more protein. It's also got about 60% starch in a common bean. As compare that to something like a soybean, where we have about 35 to 45% protein in soybeans, and there's only about 20% starch max in those soybeans. So by adding the common bean, we're still upping the overall protein, which is good for winter, because protein helps with the feather regrowth. That's usually a thing in the winter, because chickens tend to molt over the winter when their eggs slow down, and they need usually a little extra protein to really help their feathers regrow. And the bean has a little bit more overall digestible energy than corn does. So by adding common bean to the feed mix just a little bit, just sprinkling some out there for the chickens, by adding some bean, we are actually increasing the protein and slightly increasing the metabolizable energy that's in that feed. Two things left. The next one here is alfalfa. Alfalfa meal, alfalfa pellets, maybe if you have alfalfa hay, that can work, although they do get much more function out of a meal and a pellet because they never eat all the stems out of alfalfa hay. Alfalfa, it's very low energy compared to corn and soy and beans and all that kind of stuff. It is high in minerals, and it can be fairly high in vitamins depending on how it was handled and processed. Usually there's not much vitamin left by the time it's been processed into pellets or whatnot, but it does have chlorophyll as long as it's still green, and that's one of the big keys here. Chlorophyll is a powerful antioxidant, and that antioxidant actually literally removes physical stress from the birds. It will help deal with the stress of winter, with the cold stress. I can actually see, we'll do some autopsies on birds, and we can see a actual difference on them if they were fed a high antioxidant diet versus a non-antioxidant diet in the winter. You can see the effects of winter stress on their body and on their internal organs. So the antioxidants that are in your commercially available alfalfa, as well as the minerals that are in it and the protein profile. Alfalfa is usually about 18% protein, so its protein is kind of high enough for chicken feed. It's low on lysine. Well, that's not so bad because the chickens aren't really laying a lot of eggs in the winter. I usually recommend people try to give their chickens a break in the winter because winter's stressful enough, and let them go into molting over the winter. Well, molting, they need a lot of protein, and they need some key minerals for that regrowth of feathers. And we get both the perfect amino acid profiles and a wonderful selection of those minerals in alfalfa. Alfalfa is a high protein, and it's high in the amino acids that the chickens really need for their regrowth of feathers. So it's very, very, very beneficial for that. The last thing here is molasses. molasses is approximately 50% sugar, 50% water. Plus or minus. And it actually has about half the calories of a corn. Molasses has about half of the calories of corn because it's 50% water. Sugar is actually equal in calories, about pound for pound, to corn. The big difference here is that the molasses can be added to a feed or a grain without increasing the volume of it. So if I can take 5 gallons of corn and I can pour a gallon of molasses in it, and I still only have 5 gallons of corn. It's just 5 gallons of molasses corn. That molasses seeps down into the cracks and crevices between the grains or between the pellets. It coats everything well, and what you get is a more concentrated, more condensed feed. So we are able to add more fast metabolizing energy to our feed that way. Now, it's not the same as adding something like an extra protein or extra oil to up the feed value, because the molasses, that sugar, is usable almost immediately when the birds take it in. Their body wants to start processing that very, very quickly. And in the winter, that's great because they are under extra stress and they can immediately use that energy to produce heat. So you do want to watch it with molasses, because the other thing that sugar tends to do, if they don't need the energy immediately for something like something like extra exercise, I don't know when you'd exercise a chicken, or for cold weather when they need it immediately for body heat, it tends to be turned into fat. So you can get fat chickens quite quickly if you don't be careful with it. But in the cold winter, it's quite handy. Now, a little something to think about here. You're probably thinking about, is this a lot of potency in that sugar we're adding calorie-wise? Well, let's see here. If I take 5 gallons of corn and I add 1 gallon of molasses to it, all I have done is add about 10% total calories to my 5 gallons of corn by adding an entire gallon of molasses to it. Usually, when molasses is added to something like a sweet feed, it's added at something like about a 3% inclusion rate, sometimes at a 5%. So quite low generally, and it's not really enough to make much of a functional difference at all unless you go heavy on it. Molasses doesn't really have a whole lot of any mineral profile to it. It doesn't really have any protein, with the exception of a beet molasses, which is a much less common molasses. The sugar beet molasses has significantly more protein. It has a good amount of protein in it, and it actually has a pretty good wide array of beneficial minerals in it, whereas your standard cane molasses, which is almost all the molasses you're going to be able to buy, even up here in the north where we grow sugar beets, almost all the molasses is cane molasses, and it's only got a little bit of potassium, little bit of calcium, tiny bit of magnesium. That's about it. There's not much to it. So there are 5 ingredients for adding to your chicken feed in the wintertime: fermented grains, sunflower seed, beans, alfalfa, and molasses. Don't forget to join the Facebook group Homestead Know-How, and go check out the blog at northernhomesteading.com. I'll catch you later. Bye now.